Good afternoon, everybody. We're just about to start our webinar this afternoon, which is on overcoming challenges with engaging children on the autistic spectrum in food lessons. And we're delighted to welcome here at BNF Peter Imre, who's a special needs trainer, advisor and writer. And I'm sure he'll explain who he is in a moment. But before we actually start, just want to go through a couple of housekeeping issues. So just thinking about the webinar itself, it's being recorded and will be available for future use on Food Effective Life website and also on YouTube, and we'll let you know when that's happening. Please make sure that you're already in the chat box. It'd be lovely to have your comments and questions as we go along. Please also make sure that it's done to panelists and attendees, and then that means that we can see your comments and questions, as can everybody else. And at the end of the webinar, you'll be redirected to a short evaluation. That will take just about a minute, and it'd be great if you could complete that for us. And then once you have, you'll be downloaded to the, you'll be directed to the downloadable certificate. So just about ready to start, and so please do let us know any questions that you may have. So thank you very much, Peter.
Okay, good afternoon. So, okay, we're going to be talking about children, young people and adults with autism and the problems that they might have in specifically engaging with food and the making of food or within lessons. What I need to say to you really is that autism is a very complex condition. It is impossible for me to do justice to autism or understanding of autism within half an hour, but you can go on various websites. I would recommend the Autistic Society website as being a fairly easy one to log on to and to understand it in fairly simple language. I think generally speaking, when thinking about why people with autism have problems with food activities and food lessons, there are four real areas, and these four apply to the nature of autism itself. So I'm going to go through them generally very quickly, really. So the four are taken up with a 3 and then a 1. That'll make more sense later on, maybe. The 3 are the Triad of Impairments. These were first indicated as being related to autism by Lorna Wing, and I can't remember what Gould's Christian name is, but anyway, the picture you see is of Lorna Wing, and they came up with 3 areas of difficulty. People with autism are diagnosed by having difficulties within all 3 areas. So these 3 areas are problems with language and communication, problems with social interaction, and problems with flexibility of thought and acceptance of change. The thing to remember within autism is that it affects around about 1 in 100 of the whole population. So it's very, very likely that you'll have some children in your school who have autism. It is a spectrum. So there are those who have mild autism and those who have very severe autism. It's impossible to give a complete definition for all children, young people and adults with autism. I quite like Lorna Wing's idea when she said that show me one child with autism and I will show you one child with autism. In other words, all children with autism, like all children everywhere, are different, and we need to accept that difference and understand that difference. But there will be commonalities within the condition. Those 3, though, that you see before you are 3 of them, and then the other big one, and it's a huge one when it comes down to food and food technology, which is the sensory impairments and sensory difficulties. So 1 in 100, it's a spectrum. 4 to 1, boys to girls. It's not anything to do particularly with first world. You could say things like ADHD are definitely or seem to be a first world condition, whereas autism is not particularly. It probably has always been around, it's just that we haven't known it to be around. First, it was identified in 1944 by Kanner in America, and then a year later in Germany by Hans Asperger, hence the Asperger syndrome. So Asperger's often is considered to be high functioning autism, but I quite like the American definition, the current American definition, which abolishes Asperger's syndrome. What they say is that autism is a condition that applies right across the board, from very severe learning difficulties right through to very high functioning. Part of the condition is that you can like people or not like people. This was often the difference between Asperger's syndrome and autism per se, sometimes called Kanner's autism, in that Asperger's syndrome was regarded as being the kids were, young people, adults were high functioning and generally wanted to have relationships with people, not very good at it, but wanted to have relationships with people. Whereas autism was considered to be often with learning difficulties and not wanting to have relationships with people. I think the more we know about autism, and really we've discovered an awful lot, especially over the last 20 years, mainly as a result of people with autism writing about their own autism. And because we've discovered these things, and there's been a much greater recognition of autism, the 1 in 100 that I mentioned previously, the studies of 20 years ago were about 1 in 250. So we come down, indeed there are some studies with 1 to 80, but 1 in 100 you're fairly safe. And the more we know about autism, the more complex it becomes. And certainly it's fair to say that it's in a very wide spectrum. Basically, around about 50 to 60% of those with autism are likely to have additional attendant learning difficulties, and they can be very severe or quite moderate. There's no known cause for autism, and there's no known cure. So once you've got autism for life. And really, the other really interesting thing about autism, and especially with regard to teachers, is that it's not possible for people with autism to tone their own autism down. They have autism and that's it. And teachers and school staff really do need to make adjustments. I think normally within a classroom you can expect kids to make adjustments. Often people with autism, it is just not possible to make adjustments, especially those who are quite a way along the spectrum. It may be possible for people with mild autism, but once you've got fairly severe or very severe autism, it's just not possible to make those adjustments. So this carries a lot of meaning when it comes down to organizing your classroom and organizing the way that you teach. Okay, so let's have a look at each one in turn. So possible, probable difficulties with communication. And it's possible, probable because, again, all children are different and some will have quite extreme difficulties in these areas and some will not. Generally speaking, those with autism are likely to have a very concrete understanding of language, that what you say is what is understood. This has real problems with regard to the way teachers talk to a class generally. So it's quite difficult to say, okay, class, put your papers away, books away, and get out your aprons and start work, because someone with autism might not regard themselves as being class. My name is Peter, my name is not class. So if you do general instructions to a whole group, even if you're dividing kids into particular groups, blue group or red group or whatever it is, children with autism may not understand this. I get really interested in the whole idea about commonly understood meanings and nuance and contextual conversations, because we use this all of the time. One particular instruction to a child was go to the toilet and wash your hands. So the child with autism went to the toilet, lifted up the bowl of the toilet and washed their hands in the toilet, because that's what they were told to do. There are lots of these, raining cats and dogs and all sorts of things which we might understand as not being literal, but of course the person with autism might not. My favorite one is a young boy who was sent off. He wasn't sent off, he went off to camp during the school holidays. First time he'd been away from home. He'd have been year 5 or 6, age 10 or 11. And his mother, who was slightly concerned, he was autistic, his mother was slightly concerned about how he might be, because he wasn't particularly good at looking after himself from a washing and dressing and etc. point of view. And she said, look, please, whatever you do, make sure you put a clean pair of socks on every day. So he came back at the end of the week with 7 pairs of socks on, and of course he couldn't get his shoes on because nobody had told him to take the socks off once he'd worn them for the day. Again, commonly understood that would be, but not for him. So really, really do consider the instructions you're giving to individuals, especially around following recipes, and make sure that they're logical, and make sure that you're not taking things for granted that children will understand, because they might not. And it sometimes appears to those who don't have an understanding of children with autism that children are being deliberately stupid or deliberately obstructive. That's not the case. They really don't understand. Okay, the last thing on there is the last point on the PowerPoint, that autism is the only condition where language and communication can go off in separate directions. So that simply because you can talk does not necessarily mean to say that you can communicate. Language and communication are 2 different things. Children with autism may well be able to talk, may well be able to read, may well be able to write. It does not mean to say that they can use language in order to communicate effectively. Okay, so the next one is social interaction, and really this encapsulates the whole condition of autism, which is a social condition. Autism is indicative of social difficulties and problems. And I would recommend a particular book to you here, which is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. Fantastic book, really, really cleverly written. He doesn't actually mention autism throughout the book. It is, if you don't know it, and I'm sure you probably do, a novel, but and if you've read it before, read it again, because it's full of insights about autism. And Christopher Boone, who is the hero of the story, is one of those on the spectrum, and I suspect he's quite a way on the spectrum, who really doesn't have any inclination to be with people at all. He just doesn't understand people. The book is really well plotted out, almost like a detective crime fiction novel that you, as a reader without autism, solve within page 1 or 2. But poor Christopher goes the whole 100 pages and still hasn't worked out what the hell's going on. So it's because of the complexities of social interaction that he has no chance of understanding and doesn't understand at all. He's really interesting because he goes to a special school. He's very into maths as one of his big things, and he has a one-to-one who asks him so at one stage, so how was your evening? How was your night, Christopher? When he comes back into school, he said, I had a really good night. He said, I had my favorite dream, slept well. Another thing you need to know, that people with autism often don't sleep well. 2 hours can be a major achievement of sleeping. He said, how was your night? Really good. I had a really good night. I had my favorite dream. What was that, Christopher? Oh, that is that a mystery virus has invaded the world and killed everybody except for me and people like me, which means I can go into shops and have anything I want to eat and nobody's going to tell me otherwise. And then I can take a £1 coin and rub it across a radiator for hours and hours and hours, and nobody's going to tell me that I'm wasting my time. This is, again, an indication of Christopher's ambivalence about people. At best, he's ambivalent. and probably actually doesn't want to engage at all with people, because basically he finds them a mystery. There are a number of studies that have been made about people with autism not being able to read faces. What they tend to do is look at lips. They look at this area here. It may be in order to lip read because they feel it might help them to understand the language. Of course, they understand the language, or they hear the language and don't necessarily understand it. And what they don't understand is all the affective stuff that goes in the face and goes on around the person who's talking. Because there's so much language and communication, so much communication is entirely contextual, and changes in meaning all of the time. Okay, so the next one is possible probable difficulties with flexibility of thought. It used to be originally the Triad of Impairments was about imagination, but I think it's fairly evident that people with autism don't lack imagination. What they struggle with is change in routine. So it's very important to keep routine very steady and very safe and very secure, and change it at your peril with somebody with autism who may not be able to cope with change. It's not that they can't cope with change, it's that you've got to give them lots of warning about change. Don't automatically think that somebody can cope with even the slightest change, because they might not be able to if you don't give them warning. Providing you give them warning, there's a reasonable chance that they will be able to cope with it. But it's the warning that's really important. Okay, the general thing about flexibility of thought comes within having an understanding of other people's motives for doing things. And there's a little thing called a theory of mind, which is quite interesting. The suggestion is that children with autism, children and people, even adults with autism, lack theory of mind. And basically theory of mind is the understanding that different people have different thoughts and feelings to myself. And indeed, even different people can have false understandings. Generally speaking, quite interestingly, those with autism don't tell lies. They don't tell lies because they don't see the point, because everybody thinks the same thing. You will have an understanding that even if I tell you something, that you will know the same thing as I do. So telling lies implies that different people will have different thoughts and feelings, again, which people with autism might not necessarily understand. So the fourth impairment comes in, and I think this is maybe the most important one with regard to food technology specifically. All of the others that I've just talked about will affect every single teacher who teaches anybody with autism. They will need to know certainly about the Triad of Impairments. The fourth impairment on sensory processing, again, is something that we've learned a considerable amount of over the last 10 or 20 years. I would really recommend that you have a look at Ayres for Autism. It's a short video. Somebody would tell you it lasts for exactly 11 minutes. It was made by people with autism, that is, those who are appearing and those who are speaking in it have autism. Listen out for the American voice in it, which sounds like a young boy, but actually is Temple Grandin, who's very, very well known. She's one of the people, very, very high functioning person with autism, who talks about her own autism, writes about her own autism. Yes, she's very well known, so listen out for her particularly. But it's a fascinating video because it just explores the whole nature of sensory impairment, and indeed what it's like to have autism, and how other people view you and how you view other people in the world. It was made around about 20 years ago by a guy named Tim Webb, but still incredibly relevant. So you can go on YouTube and look at it as soon as you stop seeing this. Okay, so the general summary of the autistic spectrum is that it usually is identified fairly early on, but it can be, there are a number of people, especially in prison, who probably have not been identified with autism at all. We know a lot more about it over the last 20 years. So it's unusual at the moment for a child with autism not to have a diagnosis of autism. Unusual, but not unknown. So it affects social communication, social interaction, flexibility of thought and sensory processing. It's a condition for life, and there is no known cure. Okay, so let's have a look a little bit more about sensory processing, because I think this is the area that will particularly affect food technology and food technology lessons. So there are 7 senses. I think we need to. There are 5 obvious ones, but there's also 2 kinesthetic senses. So one is the proprioceptive system, which is what happens with touch, and the connection about where your body is, how your body is in relation to other parts of your body. So it's a whole body understanding. There's also a vestibular system, which is about where you are in space. So proprioceptive and vestibular are 2 additional senses, but I suspect that the main ones that will occur within food technology are probably smell, taste, touch, and sight. So the big thing about sensory processing problems is that it may well be that your kids are not fully aware of the difficulties that they have, because they regard it as being normal. They regard their sensory processing as being normal. They won't necessarily have an indication that it's different from other people's. And often it's something that they might not be able to talk about, because they might not be able to elucidate or to explain rationally to other people. Generally speaking, those who have sensory processing difficulties have problems with hyper-sensitivity, that is, being oversensitive or intolerant to particular sensory experiences. Some may also suffer from hypo-sensitivity, that is, being undersensitive to. Usually those are kids who you might find being very needing to be squeezed, needing to be having lots of weighted blankets. Your occupational therapist will probably be aware of their difficulties. They might be looking at very strong lights. They might be listening really close up to speakers, get high sounds levels. I would not worry too much about hyposensitivity, but be more concentrating on hypersensitivity. The difficulties are that you may have some children who are both hypersensitive and hyposensitive. They might be at the same time, and they might have different tolerance levels over the course of the week, and indeed over the course of the day. So it's quite tricky to work out the level of tolerance or intolerance that might be applying to any individual at any one particular time. You'll only know that by knowing the child really, really, really well. But get some advice from your occupational therapist if you have occupational therapists, and if you don't, there should be some that are around in the local education authority, although the way education is being cut back at the moment, local education resources being cut back, that might not be possible. Okay, I haven't got too long, have I? 5 minutes. I'm looking at the I'm looking over here. Okay, so very quickly, tactile system, big problems with sense of touch. Generally speaking, the receptors are over the whole of the body, but it will be, I think, in relation to cooking, about touching particular foods, especially wet foods. There might be a problem with that, with mixing with the hands. There might be a problem about being overprotective and discriminatory in the tactile system. So what happens normally is that your body is naturally defensive, so that if you touch something that doesn't feel right, you will withdraw from that. It's a protective system. But what happens when it goes awry is that people may get overprotective to particular areas of touch. These will lead undoubtedly to high levels of anxiety. I think the nature of sensory intolerance is this fight, fright, or flight reaction, so that we must not assume that children can tolerate things when they indicate that they can't. And what you need to do effectively is treat it like a phobia. So if you would imagine somebody being really phobic about dogs or spiders or sharks or heights, or you can't say that okay, well we'll just take you up to the top of a very tall mountain and hang you over the edge and then you'll get used to it. It's not going to work like that. And you've got to do it really, really, really gradually over a long period of time. So the other areas that I think, the big areas that will apply to those in a kitchen area or in a food tech area, are tactile. So it's messy areas are very typically things that children with autism are going to have problems being around. They may also have difficulties being close to other people, and so that might not be able to work in groups, might not be able to work closely with other people, might get upset by that. Very likely to be have problems with noise or be distracted by noise easily, and very typically children who do this a lot or who need to wear headphones. There are lots of things that you can do within that, and again, I'm kind of rushing this now, talking to your OT. Visual areas might also be problematic with foodstuffs touching each other on the plate. Very typically, children with autism have a problem with mixing things up. They might not be able to cope with that. The huge area is going to be oral intolerance and being able to taste things, put things in their mouths that they're really not happy with. I think what you need to think about is that somebody who expresses a reluctance to taste certain foods with autism may well be experiencing the same thing that you would experience if somebody asked you to eat a bucket of sick. It's not something you would easily do, even if they told you that it was really okay. So all of the jungle things, you know, that you have horrors about, eating spiders, eating snakes, eating God knows what else. This is exactly what somebody with autism might be experiencing every single day. Then you're asking them to taste things and put things in their mouth. This is a real problem. How are we doing for time?
It's 27 minutes past, but okay. You're fine, you carry on.
Okay. Okay, so the last one that I didn't bring up is olfactory, and again, strong smells. Often people with autism are attracted to strange smells, but it might well also have the opposite effect, that they are discombobulated by strong smells. And again, you're likely, cooking certainly is an area for the olfactory sense, so you might need to consider those. So helping the oversensitive people really is keeping it. Knowledge is a great, have an understanding. Talk to your parents, not your parents, the parents of the children. Talk to TAs, talk to anybody who knows the young person. They will be able to tell you what their problems are. Ignore them or downplay them at your peril. You may do that, but it won't have any effect. The person with autism will still be unable to work within the confines that you're asking them to work. So we need to respect the person's need to be cautious about the unfamiliar or uncomfortable input. You need to really, really pay attention to variables that are in your control, particularly people, noise factors, light factors, the time of the day, the environment around them. And I think a big thing would be less is more. So if you're looking for change, or if you're looking for children to work more closely with areas that they're uncomfortable with, less is more. Do little tiny bits and take it over a long period of time. Don't ask them to make big changes very quickly, because you're very likely to be dissatisfied with the results. Use a very simple reward strategy. You can have a big reward. So you need to know what they're motivated by. If you do a tiny bit of work in the general area you want them to work, gradually build up over a period of time. Don't rush things. Accept that the person can have bad days when they're not able to tolerate change. You need to go back to the start, and gradually accept that over a long period of time, you may be able to broaden the processing range by introducing acceptable rituals or routines. It's the child or the young person who will indicate to you what is acceptable. So you need to give them the controlling influence about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. Okay, I think that's probably. Okay, just quick references. One of the big ones. Well, Olga Bogdashina is very good. I think these are all good, but if you can only read one, read Mark Haddon, Curious into the Dog at Night Time. But these are all good. Yes, Bogdashina because it's sensory, and Smith and Miles also sensory, high functioning sensory. So actually that might be a slightly better one. Don't worry about the dates. The book's still good, even though it's 15 years old, it's still good. Because it's Asperger's syndrome, it will be about high functioning guys. So maybe the Smith-Miles one, it's an American book, but still okay.
Great, thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. We've got a couple of questions actually before we move on to just thinking about the Food Effective Life resources. So from Janet, I work with deaf children, all of whom have additional conditions. I teach cooking to these children every week, and a lot of what has been talked about is displayed by the children in my group. So that's actually just a comment really rather than a question, which is great. This is a question though. Is it better practice to pair students up?
Possibly. I think generally speaking, children, young people with autism work better in a small group than a big group. So what you need to consider is how whoever you're pairing up, or maybe 3 or 4 might be a good little grouping. The other 3, apart from the person with autism, are fairly tolerant of the young person. And remember that people with autism can sometimes be quite intolerant of other people, especially if they're not particularly interested in relationships and engagements. So you need to think carefully about your group. I would say 3 or 4 is probably a better number than a pairing up.
Okay, great, thank you. And then, do autistic students need the same familiar face each week in the classroom?
I think it helps if you've got somebody they can trust. You know, if you've got a TA or a familiar TA, or even somebody who doesn't mind working with the person with autism, that's always helpful. It helps with the continuity, I think, and but the child with autism has got to be able to trust the person. The other thing is that if you've got a teaching assistant, they can help to read the difficulties the person with autism might have, especially if they know the child really well. But it's not something that you can give automatically to anyone, and I think the teaching assistant who's working with the young person needs to know them very well.
Great, thank you. And then one more. I'm struggling to get students who have been cooking for a while and who are quite able cooks to be creative and adapt recipes, write their own recipes. Any ideas how I can help them with this?
Oh, right. Well, that's a really, really interesting question, because it kind of falls in with the whole thing about autism. In the people with autism are really good at following rules. Therefore recipes, but they'll follow them absolutely. The idea about variations on that might be quite difficult for people with autism. In many ways, people with autism may be better suited to baking rather than cooking, because that becomes much more scientific, is my understanding. I'm not a great baker, but that's my understanding. The idea that you're going to have somebody with autism being able to put in a glug of this and a bit of that and change things around is really quite tricky. Now, I'm not saying that people with autism cannot be creative, because of course they can, but you have to lead them into the idea about creativity and really give them an okay about creativity. Maybe start off with just being creative in one change of recipes. So if you've got a recipe with 10 basic ingredients, just change one ingredient at a time, work with that and do it gradually and slowly. The idea of just letting loose and saying, okay, you go on and create your own dish might be a bit problematic. So less is more, and slowly over time.
Actually, Peter, one of the other attendees has commented to Sarah actually and said, we've been doing a bake-off and started with plain scones and asked our students to make a change. Some of them could imagine a change, some couldn't and needed more help. So
yeah, that's fundamentally, that's about the mark of it. And yes, you need to do it really slowly. Just change one ingredient at a time. It's just a longer term thing, that's all. So you might be looking at change which might take a year, whereas with other people it might only take a couple of weeks.
Okay, and one more. This may be a bit too specialist, but we'll see. How can adjustments be made in a practical food lesson, trying to keep to the scheme of work, for example, chili con carne, hot spices and chili, food preferences and promoting skills?
Not sure I understand the question.
I think it's because if you're following a scheme of work,
right,
you try to keep to that if possible.
Okay.
So you've got children with different needs.
Okay. Well, of course, you know, especially with hot foods and spicy foods, you may, people with autism often are very particular about what they eat. So I've known children with autism who only eat Pringles crisps. And I really mean only eat Pringles crisps. They won't eat anything else at all. So if you've got somebody who will have who has a very restricted diet because they have difficulties with texture, taste, touch, of food particularly, then you might have a lot of problems getting them to cook stuff that they're not going to like, they're not going to like smelling, they're not going to like tasting, they're not going to like touching. In that case, you maybe need to think about offering variations to them about what they might cook. So it's not that they can't cook, it's just that they might be able to only cook certain things. So chili con carne may be without the chili, or maybe without the carne. I don't know. You know, you need to be thinking, it's you who needs to be flexible. This is the difficulty with people with autism. Often they can't be flexible. So in this situation, it's the teacher who needs to be flexible, not the child.
Great, thank you. So following on from that, actually, one of the attendees says, I allow my students to choose what they make each week to give them some control. It works well. Yeah,
fantastic. That's absolutely the idea. And those with autism might have limited choices, but gradually by giving them control, I think you can stretch them out a little bit, but it's taking a long-term view of it rather than a rigid view of it.
Great. Another person says, we put out examples on the table and they could then choose from them in the end.
And again, that's a really good way if you've got lots of different choices, providing you're sure that one of the choices is something that the child with autism is willing and able to cook.
Great. Right. Well, thank you for those questions, everybody. And thank you ever so much, Peter. That was really interesting. Just very quickly, going to have a quick look at the Food a Fact of Life resources. On the website, you'll find a huge number of updated resources, some of which you might find particularly helpful for children with special needs and perhaps with autism. So we've got food cards, we've got equipment cards, and this is another food card. So we've got vegetables, we've got fruit, equipment cards. We've also got bingo boards. That's always quite fun as well. So you can give them the board and perhaps the name, and then they can play the game with that. We've got equipment jigsaws, so you could cut those up so that the pupils can actually match them together afterwards. And then also, those of you who might remember the License to Cook resources, we've got new picture versions of the recipes. Now, these have been developed with a special needs teacher, and she suggested that we actually divided each of the instructions into a little card and actually changed the colour, and then these could perhaps be cut up and actually given to the pupil one at a time, so they knew exactly what they should be doing at each stage. So you'll find those on the website. If you just go into the search box and just put in License to Cook, it will come up with all the different License to Cook recipes and also the resources. So with the recipes, you've got a word version, you've got this version, which is a PowerPoint, and then you've got a straightforward PowerPoint. So hopefully those you'll find quite useful. Right, so thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. We'd be very grateful if you could complete the webinar evaluation for us. And that's the link on the screen, but as soon as we close down the webinar, you should be taken to the evaluation. If by any chance you don't, we'll send out an email tomorrow with the link, and that'd be great if you could do that. And then you'll receive your certificate of attendance. And finally, the next webinars. So we've got 3 webinars coming up. So we've got feeding of infants and young children with a focus on behavioural aspects. That's on the 22nd of May. We've got food literacy versus food skills. That's currently the 18th of June. That may well be changed, but we'll let you know about that. And then we've got quality calorie, which is on the 4th of July at 8 p.m. But you'll find out all the information about all of our training, our online training, and also our face-to-face sessions on the website. So please do have a look. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Peter. That was a really interesting webinar. And if you've got any other questions, please do let us know. And I'm sure Peter might be willing to answer them at another point. No
problem at all. If I could just say, if you wanted to email me directly, I'm very happy for you to do that. peter.imray@hotmail.co.uk. And I'm very happy to talk to people individually.
Great, that's super. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.